My boyfriend declared, "My ex is coming to our party. Be cool or it's over." I replied, "I'll be very cool." Then I greeted her at the door, shook her hand, and said, "He's all yours." I was just leaving. His party ended the moment I walked out. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old, and if there's one thing people have always known about me, it's that I don't make decisions without thinking them through. I'm an architect. My entire career revolves around anticipating problems before they exist. Every wall, every beam, every inch of a building begins as lines on a blueprint. One mistake hidden beneath the surface can bring everything crashing down years later. I believed relationships worked the same way. For the past 2 years, I'd been dating Nathan Brooks, 28. Where I organized everything down to the smallest detail, Nathan lived almost entirely on instinct. He'd laugh when I color-coded grocery lists. I'd tease him for buying furniture because it felt right, instead of measuring the room first. Somehow it worked. At least, I thought it did. 8 months earlier, Nathan had moved into my apartment. Technically, it was still my apartment. I'd signed the lease long before we met. My name was the only one on it. I covered roughly 70% of the rent along with every utility bill because I earned considerably more than he did. Nathan worked part-time as a personal stylist, and I genuinely didn't mind carrying more of the financial weight. I never kept score. To me, a relationship wasn't about splitting every dollar exactly down the middle. It was about building something together. Our apartment became that dream. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. Warm oak floors reflected the afternoon sunlight. Every room had been designed with intention. But my favorite part wasn't the furniture. It was the technology hidden behind the walls. I'd spent nearly a year building a custom smart home system from scratch. Most people bought expensive commercial systems. I built mine myself. A dedicated server hidden inside the hallway closet controlled every light, every speaker, every automated routine, and 3 massive digital art displays mounted throughout the apartment. I called it Aura. Nathan absolutely loved showing it off. Whenever friends visited, he'd grin and say, "Emily made the apartment smarter than both of us." Then he'd tell everyone to watch. With one tap on my phone, the lights shifted into soft amber. Music drifted through every room. Digital artwork slowly transformed across the walls. People were always amazed. Nathan loved taking credit for living there. I loved seeing him excited. So when spring finally arrived, I decided to throw the biggest party we'd ever hosted. Not just another casual gathering. Something memorable. I spent weeks planning everything, from the guest list and seating arrangements to the playlists and catering. Over $1,200 went toward food alone. Another $800 disappeared into a carefully selected collection of premium whiskey, tequila, wine, and craft gin. Aura's lighting scenes were scheduled hour by hour. Music would transition naturally as the evening progressed. The digital artwork matched each stage of the night. Everything had been rehearsed. Everything was ready. Or so I believed. 3 days before the party, everything changed. It was Tuesday evening. Nathan had been unusually quiet all day. He spent the entire afternoon staring at his phone, typing a few words, deleting them, then starting over again as if he couldn't decide what to say. I noticed almost immediately. After 2 years together, even the smallest change in his behavior was impossible to miss. Finally, he leaned against the kitchen counter without looking directly at me. I looked up from my laptop. You know Sophia's back in town? My fingers froze above the keyboard. Sophia, his ex-girlfriend, the woman whose name I'd heard far more often than I ever wanted to, was suddenly standing between us again. According to Nathan, she'd been the love of his early 20s. Their breakup had supposedly devastated them both. He always insisted they were completely over each other. Yet somehow, her name never disappeared for very long. "I heard she moved back," I answered carefully. He nodded. "I ran into her yesterday." Something tightened in my chest. "Oh, we talked for a while." I stayed quiet. "And?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I invited her to the party Friday." I honestly wondered if I'd heard him correctly. "You what?" He finally met my eyes. "I invited Sophia." I blinked. "Without asking me?" I didn't think it was a big deal. I slowly closed my laptop. "Nathan, this is our housewarming party." "I know. Our friends are coming." "I know." "And you invited your ex-girlfriend into our home." He shrugged. "She wanted to see the apartment." I stared at him. "You seriously don't hear how strange that sounds?" He sighed dramatically. "There you go. What does that mean?" "I knew you'd react like this. I'm reacting because you made a decision that affects both of us without even asking. We're adults, Emily." "I am. So is she." "I didn't say she wasn't. We're friends now." "That's wonderful. So what's the problem?" I took a slow breath. "The problem is that I don't feel comfortable." He rolled his eyes. "You don't trust me?" This isn't about trust. It sounds exactly like trust. No, it's about respect. Neither of us spoke, and the quiet between us felt heavier than either of us wanted to admit. I waited for him to understand. Instead, his expression hardened. His arms crossed over his chest. She's coming. I frowned. What? I already invited her. Then tell her plans changed. No, Nathan, I'm not embarrassing myself because you're insecure. The word hit harder than I expected. Insecure? Yes. I'm telling you your decision crossed a boundary. And I'm telling you you're making this weird. I looked at him for a long moment. The man standing in front of me wasn't trying to reassure me. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't compromising. He was testing how much I'd tolerate. Then he said the sentence that quietly ended our relationship. Just be cool about it. I didn't answer. He continued. Seriously, if you're going to act paranoid every time my ex is around. He paused. Then maybe we have a bigger problem. Another pause. Then came the ultimatum. Be cool. He looked directly into my eyes. It's over. The apartment became strangely quiet. I could still hear the refrigerator humming, traffic outside, the dishwasher finishing its cycle. But inside my head, everything stopped. I searched his face. I expected hesitation, regret, anything. Instead, I saw confidence, almost amusement, as though he already knew I'd give in. As though this was simply another argument I'd lose because keeping the relationship mattered more to me than standing up for myself. Something inside me shifted. Not anger, not heartbreak. Clarity. The kind that arrives when you finally notice the crack running through a foundation you've trusted for years. I suddenly realized this conversation wasn't about Sophia. It wasn't even about the party. It was about whether my self-respect could be negotiated. Nathan's shoulders relaxed the instant I agreed. A small, satisfied smile spread across his face, the kind people wear when they're convinced they've already won. He leaned in, kissed my forehead, and said, I knew you'd understand. I held his gaze for a brief moment before answering quietly, You're right. I'll be very cool. Still smiling to himself, he disappeared into the bedroom as though the conversation had gone exactly the way he'd planned. After he disappeared into the bedroom, I stayed in the kitchen without moving. Outside, thousands of city lights flickered beyond the windows, but inside the apartment, the silence suddenly felt louder than the traffic below. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't thinking about how to save the relationship. I was thinking about what it would feel like to walk away from it. 3 days later, Friday evening finally arrived. The apartment looked exactly the way I'd imagined after weeks of planning. Guests laughed over cocktails while warm amber light filled every room. Aura quietly synchronized the music in the background, and the digital artwork shifted across the walls exactly on schedule. Nathan looked happier than I'd seen him in weeks. Then, at exactly 9:02 p.m., the doorbell rang. The doorbell echoed through the apartment, barely audible beneath the music. Even so, I knew exactly who it was. Nathan looked at me from across the living room. There it was again. That subtle warning hidden behind a smile. Remember, he mouthed. Be cool, I smiled back. It was the easiest smile I'd worn all night. I've got the door, I said. Several guests stepped aside as I crossed the room. Weeks of preparation, thousands of dollars, countless late nights. Everything was perfect. I reached for the handle. When I opened the door, a young woman stood in the hallway holding a bottle of wine. She looked exactly the way I'd imagined from all the stories Nathan used to tell. Long, dark hair resting over one shoulder, a fitted white blouse beneath a light leather jacket, and the kind of confident smile that suggested she had no idea she'd just walked into the middle of someone else's breakup. Sophia? She nodded. You must be Emily. I am. For just a second, we simply looked at each other. There was no hostility in her expression, only curiosity, maybe even awkwardness, which made me wonder, did she know Nathan had invited her without telling me? Or had she been given a completely different version of the story? I smiled warmly. I'm glad you found the place. Thanks. She handed me the wine. I hope this is okay. It looks great. Then I extended my hand. Welcome. She shook it. Her grip was gentle. Behind me, I heard Nathan approaching. There you are. His voice sounded brighter than it had all evening. Nathan barely looked at me before walking straight toward Sophia as though she'd been the person he'd been waiting for all evening. When they finally stepped apart, Nathan rested a hand on Sophia's shoulder for a second while they laughed about something only the two of them seemed to understand. It wasn't openly inappropriate, but it was familiar enough to make several nearby conversations fade into awkward silence. It wasn't intimate enough to shock anyone outright, but it lasted just long enough for several nearby conversations to fade before everyone awkwardly pretended nothing unusual had happened. Nathan either didn't notice the silence he'd created or simply didn't care. Sophia laughed. I almost couldn't find parking. This building's always terrible. I remember. They shared one of those tiny memories that only people with history understand. I quietly watched. Every doubt I'd tried to ignore over the last 2 years suddenly arranged itself into a clear picture. It wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about an ex. It was about priorities. Tonight, I knew exactly where I ranked. Nathan finally turned toward me. You okay? I smiled. Of course. He relaxed immediately. I knew you would be. He still believed he'd won. I looked at Sophia, then back at him. My smile never faded. Well, I guess my job here is done. Nathan frowned. What do you mean? I picked up my coat from the hallway bench. You two have a wonderful evening. His face changed instantly. What are you doing? I'm leaving. He laughed nervously. Emily, don't do this. I thought you wanted me to be cool. Guests closest to the entrance had stopped pretending not to listen. Nathan lowered his voice. People are here. I know. This isn't funny. I wasn't trying to be funny. Sophia looked completely confused. Emily, I'm sorry if this feels awkward. I turned toward her, then offered my hand one more time. She accepted it automatically. I smiled politely, reached out, and shook Sophia's hand. Instead of looking at her, I lifted my eyes to Nathan. His confident smile hadn't faded yet. Almost gently, I said, He's all yours. For the first time that night, the color drained from Nathan's face. He stood frozen for a heartbeat before instinctively reaching for my wrist, but I stepped back before he could touch me. Nobody reacted. The music kept playing exactly as Aura had programmed it, yet the silence between everyone in the room somehow drowned it out. Nathan stared at me as if I'd started speaking another language. What? You heard me. I released Sophia's hand. I hope the two of you enjoy the party. Emily. His voice became sharp. Stop! I am stopping. I've decided to respect your decision. What are you talking about? You told me to be cool. I slipped my phone into my purse. Or it was over. He suddenly looked nervous. That's not what I meant. Really? No. You know what I meant. I do. And I made my choice. The silence near the doorway spread through the apartment like a ripple across water. Every conversation around us quietly died as people stopped pretending not to watch. Nathan stepped closer. We'll talk about this later. I gently shook my head. No, we won't. You can't seriously leave. I can. You'll embarrass me. I looked into his eyes. You should have thought about that before giving me an ultimatum. For the first time all evening, his confidence disappeared. Emily, please. It was almost enough to make me hesitate. Almost. Then I remembered Tuesday night. His folded arms. His smirk. His certainty that I'd never choose myself. I opened the apartment door. Just before stepping into the hallway, I looked back one last time. The apartment looked exactly the way I'd imagined it would only a few days earlier, yet somehow it no longer felt like home. I walked out. The door closed quietly behind me. Behind me, voices immediately started rising inside the apartment. Someone called Nathan's name, another guest asked what had just happened, and within minutes, people were quietly collecting their coats. Olivia glanced back at the door before looking at me. I don't think that party's going to last much longer. I didn't answer. I simply unlocked the Aura app on my phone. No dramatic slam. No shouting. Just click. The elevator hadn't arrived yet when I heard footsteps. Emily! I turned. My two closest friends, Olivia and Rachel, hurried toward me. Are you okay? Olivia asked. I am now. Rachel looked toward the apartment. Is this real? I nodded. It's over. What happened? He gave me a choice. And I accepted it. Neither of them asked another question. They already understood. The elevator doors opened. We stepped inside. As the doors slid shut, I finally pulled out my phone. Aura. The custom app opened instantly. Years ago, while testing emergency routines, I'd created a script as a joke, something I'd never imagined actually using. At the bottom of the screen, one command waited. System shutdown. Rachel glanced at the display. What is that? I smiled. Being cool. I pressed it. Inside the apartment, Aura obeyed. The music stopped in the middle of a song. Within a single heartbeat, the atmosphere I'd spent weeks creating completely unraveled. The music cut off in the middle of a chorus. Warm, amber lighting snapped back to cold white. The digital artwork vanished into black screens, and confused guests instinctively reached for phones that no longer had Wi-Fi. The digital art displays went black. Every screen in the apartment turned dark. The Wi-Fi disappeared. Guests instinctively reached for their phones. Nothing worked. No music. No ambience. No mood. Just 30 confused people standing beneath painfully bright white lights. The illusion was gone. By the time we reached the lobby, my phone was already vibrating. Nathan called over and over until the screen became nothing but his name. Then text messages. Nathan, what did you just do? Nathan, turn everything back on. Nathan, Emily, answer me. Another message. Nathan, you're ruining the party. I read each one, then typed exactly one reply. You told me to be cool or it was over. I chose over. Please have your belongings out of my apartment before the end of the month. I pressed send, blocked his number, slipped my phone back into my purse. Outside, the cool night air hit my face. For the first time in days, I could finally breathe. Behind me, somewhere high above the city, the perfect party I'd spent weeks creating was quietly falling apart. And for the first time since Tuesday, I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt free. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, even though every part of me still hurt. Grief and peace can exist at the same time, and for the first time in months, I understood that. 2 years don't disappear the moment you block someone's number. There were memories in every corner of that apartment. Weekend breakfasts. Movie nights stretched past midnight. Lazy Sunday mornings where Nathan would steal my coffee even though he insisted he hated espresso. Walking away from him hurt. Walking away from the future I'd imagined hurt even more. But beneath all of that, for the first time in months, my mind was finally quiet. The hurt hadn't disappeared, but it no longer came with doubt, and that difference mattered more than I expected. I wasn't replaying the conversation in my head looking for something I could have done differently. He'd made his choice. I'd simply accepted it. Unfortunately, Nathan hadn't expected me to. By the time I woke up the next morning, my phone had become almost unusable. Missed calls from unknown numbers blended with Instagram DMs, messenger notifications, text messages, and even LinkedIn requests from people who suddenly felt entitled to an opinion about my relationship. Apparently, people will use any platform when they're determined enough. The first message came from his best friend, Ryan. Emily. Seriously? What happened last night? Then another. Ashley. Nathan's devastated. Another? Melissa. You embarrassed him in front of everyone. By lunchtime, I counted over 40 unread messages. Most of them shared the same theme. How could I do that to him? No one seemed interested in asking why he'd invited his ex-girlfriend to our party without telling me. No one mentioned the ultimatum. They only saw the ending, not what caused it. I ignored every message. Almost every one. Around noon, one notification caught my attention. Nathan's mother, Carol. I stared at her name for several seconds before answering. Hello? Her voice sounded softer than I expected. Emily, sweetheart. I already knew where this conversation was going. I've just spoken with Nathan. I'm sure you have. He told me what happened. I'm sure he told you his version. She sighed. I know emotions were running high. Were they? Emily. He says you humiliated him. I didn't. You walked out in front of everyone. Yes. You shut off the apartment. Yes. Do you know how childish that looked? I leaned back in my chair. Carol, did Nathan tell you he invited Sophia without asking me? A pause. He mentioned she stopped by. She didn't stop by. He invited her. Carol didn't answer immediately. I could almost hear her searching for a response before she quietly said, They're just friends. They're just friends. I never said they weren't. So why does it matter? Because he made the decision for both of us. She hesitated. You could have handled it privately. I tried. Nathan says you became jealous. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was predictable. Did he also tell you what he said before the party? What do you mean? He looked me in the eyes and told me. I repeated every word. Be cool or it's over. Silence. Longer this time. Finally, she spoke again. He didn't mean it. Then he shouldn't have said it. You know how Nathan gets. I do. He's impulsive, and actions have consequences. Emily. No, I interrupted gently. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is the consequence of disrespect. Her voice became firmer. So you're really throwing away 2 years over one mistake? I closed my eyes. No. I'm ending a relationship because the person I loved believed my boundaries were negotiable. She had no answer. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, I wish you'd reconsider. So do I. I ended the call. That afternoon, I finally unblocked Nathan. Not because I wanted to reconcile, because we had practical things to discuss. I sent one message. Emily, we need to arrange a time for you to collect your belongings. His reply appeared less than 10 seconds later. Nathan, thank God, can we talk? Emily, about moving, nothing else. Nathan, Emily, please don't do this. Emily, which day are you moving out? Several minutes passed. Then, Nathan, I'm not moving. I stared at the screen. Another message arrived. Nathan, I live here too. Another. Nathan, you can't just throw me away after 2 years. I typed slowly. Emily, the lease is in my name. Nathan, this is still my home. Emily, it was our home. You ended that Tuesday night. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Finally, Nathan, then you'll have to evict me. I looked at the message for nearly a minute. Not because I was surprised. Because I realized this wasn't going to end quietly. Yeah. The following morning, my building manager called. Emily? Hi, Frank. I wanted to check something with you. Sure. I had a rather unusual request from someone in your apartment. My stomach tightened. Nathan? Frank sighed. He asked whether we could change the locks. What? He claimed you abandoned the apartment. I sat upright. He said he was worried you'd come back unexpectedly. For a moment, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He actually said that? Yes. And I wanted to verify before doing anything. I couldn't help letting out a short laugh. Frank, you've seen the lease yourself. My name has always been the only one on it. He sighed. Exactly why I wanted to call you before I responded to his request. Frank lowered his voice. I figured something wasn't adding up. He also mentioned tenant rights. He has none beyond what the law allows. I thought so. I'll handle it. I figured you would. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and did the one thing that had always helped me through difficult situations. I made a plan. First, I'd hire an attorney. Then I'd preserve every message, document every conversation, and follow the legal process exactly as it was written. Nathan wanted to turn this into a legal battle, so I decided emotion would no longer have a seat at the table. Everything would be done by the book. No shortcuts, no revenge, no mistakes. 2 days later, I hired a licensed process server. The cost wasn't insignificant, but peace of mind rarely is. That afternoon he called. Ms. Carter? Yes. He's been served. Just 4 words. Yet they carried more weight than any argument Nathan and I had ever had. The official 30-day notice had begun. The countdown was no longer emotional. It was legal. There was only one problem. Everything that mattered to my daily life was still inside that apartment. My work computer, architectural files, the Aura server, my camera equipment, and even the espresso machine I'd saved months to buy. Thousands of dollars worth of property. I wasn't leaving those behind. So I sent Nathan one final message. Emily, I'll be at the apartment Friday at 10 a.m. with a civil standby from the police department to retrieve my personal property. Please make sure everything is accessible. No reply. Which was answer enough. As Friday approached, I had the strange feeling that what happened at the party had only been the opening scene. The real battle was just beginning. Friday morning arrived with a strange kind of calm. The first few days after our breakup had been full of noise. Friends picking sides, messages from people who only knew half the story, Nathan insisting I'd overreacted, his mother trying to convince me that I should be the bigger person. By the end of the week, though, all of that had faded into the background. Now there was only one thing left to do. Get my life back. At exactly 10 o'clock, I pulled into the parking garage beneath the apartment building. 2 police officers were already waiting in the lobby for the scheduled civil standby. They weren't there to force anyone out. Their only job was to make sure nobody turned a simple property retrieval into a shouting match. One of them smiled politely as she checked my ID. Ms. Carter? That's me. You ready? I nodded. As ready as I'll ever be. The elevator ride felt much longer than usual. I'd gone up those same floors hundreds of times before, usually carrying groceries or laughing with Nathan after dinner downtown. This time, the silence inside the elevator was heavy enough to make every floor indicator feel painfully slow. When the doors finally opened, I walked toward my apartment with my key already in my hand. For one ridiculous second, I caught myself hoping he'd come to his senses. Maybe he'd packed. Maybe he'd realized dragging this out wasn't helping either of us. Maybe we'd keep this final meeting respectful. That hope disappeared the moment I reached the door. My key unlocked the deadbolt, but the door wouldn't move. Someone had locked it from the inside. One of the officers stepped forward and knocked. Police department, Ms. Carter is here to retrieve her personal property. Please open the door. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time. We're not leaving until someone answers. Nearly a minute passed before I heard footsteps. The door opened just enough for Nathan to appear. His hair was messy, like he'd only just rolled out of bed. Then my eyes drifted past him. And there she was. Sophia was curled up on my cream-colored sofa, wearing one of Nathan's oversized sweatshirts with a mug of coffee in both hands, looking comfortable enough that a stranger might have assumed she'd lived there for months. For a second, nobody spoke. Nathan finally broke the silence. You seriously brought the police? I told you I would. You could have just called. I did. You blocked me. I blocked your personal number. I texted you about today. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The female officer stepped forward. Sir, this isn't a discussion. Ms. Carter is the leaseholder. She's here to collect property she owns. We'll be here until she's finished. Nathan stepped aside reluctantly. As I walked into the apartment, it barely felt familiar. The decorations I'd carefully chosen were still there. The artwork still hung on the walls. But something had changed. It wasn't the furniture. It wasn't the lighting. It was the feeling. The place I'd spent years turning into a home suddenly felt like someone else's temporary shelter. Sophia stood awkwardly from the sofa. Emily, I looked at her. I don't have anything against you. She blinked. I didn't know things were this bad. I believe you. And strangely enough, I meant it. Nothing about her expression suggested she was enjoying any of this. If anything, she looked uncomfortable. Nathan, on the other hand, couldn't stop pacing around the living room like he was waiting for someone to tell him this was all just a misunderstanding. He watched me head straight toward the hallway closet. What are you doing? I opened the server cabinet. I'm taking my equipment. You can't. I looked over my shoulder. I absolutely can. But the smart home runs on that. I know. Emily, you built it for us. No. I unplugged the first cable before looking back at him. No, Nathan, I said quietly. I built it long before you ever moved into this apartment. The cooling fan slowed to silence. The indicator lights blinked one last time, and the server finally powered down. Nathan stared at the rack as though he couldn't believe I was actually taking it. You're really taking Aura? I spent almost a year designing it. But the lighting... The lights will still work, I replied, while disconnecting another cable. You'll just have to turn them on the old-fashioned way. One of the officers quietly looked away, trying not to smile. I carefully placed the server into the protective case I'd brought with me, making sure every cable was labeled exactly the way I'd organized them months earlier. Some habits don't disappear just because a relationship ends. From there, I walked into the office. The office looked exactly the way I'd left it, with my large monitors, custom-built workstation, and shelves lined with external drives containing years of architectural projects. Nathan hurried after me. I use that computer. No. I unplugged another cable. You use your laptop. This one's faster. That's because I paid for it. He ran a hand through his hair. Emily, come on. I'm not taking anything that's yours. But if you have a receipt with your name on it, keep it. He didn't answer. Because he couldn't. Everything I packed had been purchased long before he moved in. The officers simply watched while I worked methodically from one room to another. Nobody raised their voice. The only sounds inside the apartment were cardboard boxes sliding across the floor and packing tape sealing another chapter of my life shut. When I reached the kitchen, Nathan suddenly looked nervous. You don't need to take the espresso machine. I smiled faintly. I bought this on my 31st birthday. We used it every day. I know. You really can't leave it? You can buy another one. His shoulders dropped. Watching him slowly realize how much of his daily routine depended on things I'd provided was strangely surreal. It wasn't something I'd ever thought about while we were together because I never kept score. He had. He just assumed those things would always be there. Finally, I wheeled a storage crate toward the dining area where the bar cart stood untouched. Crystal bottles caught the morning sunlight. Most of them had never even been opened after the party. Nathan sighed. Emily, what now? Seriously? What? You're taking the liquor too? I picked up an unopened bottle of 18-year-old scotch and wrapped it carefully in protective paper. Yes, this is ridiculous. It belongs to me. We bought some of that together. I looked at him. Which bottle? He glanced across the shelves, then looked away. I don't remember. I do. I tapped one inexpensive bottle near the bottom. That one. Everything else went into my box. Sophia quietly watched the entire exchange without saying a word. She wasn't smiling anymore. The confidence she'd carried at the party was gone. Instead, she looked like someone finally realizing she'd walked into a situation far more complicated than she'd been told. As I sealed the last box, Nathan stood in the middle of the living room, looking completely defeated. So that's it? I rested one hand on the handle of the storage cart. No. He looked up hopefully. The last part is still coming. His expression changed again. The eviction, the legal process. You'd really do that? I already have. His face lost what little color it had left. You actually served me. I told you I don't bluff. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question I'd been expecting all morning. So, there's really no chance? I looked around the apartment one final time. The sunlight still poured through the windows. The city skyline was still beautiful. Everything looked exactly the same. Except us. I didn't end this relationship when Sophia walked through that door, I said quietly. I ended it the night you decided my self-respect was something I should negotiate to keep you. His eyes dropped to the floor. I picked up the final box. As I reached the doorway, I turned back one last time. You have 28 days left. Then I walked out. This time I didn't look back. Because deep down, I already knew he wasn't going to leave willingly. And that meant the next time we saw each other, it wouldn't be as two people ending a relationship. It would be across a courtroom. People love saying, take the high road. What they don't tell you is that the high road is expensive. It costs time. It costs money. And sometimes it costs months of your life while the person who created the mess keeps pretending they're the victim. 30 days came and went, but every time I checked on the apartment, it looked exactly the same. His shoes were still by the front door, his jacket still hung in the closet, and every sign told me he'd decided to pretend the deadline simply didn't exist. About a week before the deadline, his mother called me again. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "Emily," Carol began before I could say hello, "please tell me you're not actually going through with this." "I am." She sighed so heavily I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "Nathan is falling apart. I didn't ask him to. He'll have an eviction on his record." "I know. It'll follow him for years. So will the choices that caused it." "You know Sophia left him?" I leaned back in my chair without saying anything. Carol took my silence as encouragement. "She packed her things and walked out a few days ago. They're not even together anymore." That didn't surprise me. Honestly, I'd expected it. Whatever fantasy Nathan had built around reconnecting with his ex hadn't lasted very long once reality showed up. It was exciting when it meant showing off a beautiful apartment, expensive liquor, smart home technology, and a comfortable life someone else had built. It became much less exciting after the Wi-Fi disappeared, the smart system was gone, and every bill landed in his lap instead of mine. "Emily?" Carol asked softly. "I'm still here." "He's alone." So was I the night he gave me that ultimatum. "He's sorry." "I believe he is." "Then why won't you forgive him?" I stared out the office window for a long moment before answering. "Because being sorry isn't the same as taking responsibility." She didn't respond. So I continued. If Nathan had apologized the next morning, packed his things, and accepted the consequences of his decisions, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But instead, he challenged me to evict him. Carol's voice became quieter. "He thought you'd change your mind." "I didn't." "Please." "No." There wasn't any anger left in my voice anymore. Just certainty. "I hope he figures his life out." "I genuinely do. But he won't be figuring it out in my apartment." I ended the call before she could say anything else. For a while, I simply sat there looking at the framed sketches hanging in my office. When I was younger, I used to believe that difficult decisions would always feel dramatic, that your heart would race, that you'd question yourself every 5 minutes. The truth was almost disappointing. Real certainty feels quiet. Once you've made the right decision, you stop arguing with yourself. You simply keep walking. The deadline arrived on a Friday. After work, Olivia drove me back to the apartment. Part of me still hoped I'd open the door and find the place empty. Maybe he'd finally accepted reality. Maybe all of this could end without another fight. The hallway looked exactly the same. The city lights still reflected through the windows at the end of the corridor. I unlocked the door. Nothing had changed. His shoes were still by the entrance. His jacket still hung in the closet. The television was on. Empty takeout containers covered the coffee table. Nathan looked up from the sofa. "You actually came." I said I would. He muted the television. So? I guess this is where you threaten me again." I looked around the apartment. It no longer made me sad. It just looked tired. "No, I don't need to threaten you." "What does that mean?" "It means Monday morning my attorney files the eviction." His smile disappeared. "You'd really spend that kind of money?" "I already have." "You'd rather pay lawyers than work this out?" I couldn't help smiling. "Nathan, I tried to work it out. You called my boundaries insecurity. You told me to be cool or lose you. You invited your ex into our home. You refused every opportunity to fix it." He looked frustrated. "You're acting like I cheated." "No, I'm acting like respect matters." He laughed bitterly. "This is insane." "No, this is paperwork." I left before the conversation could go in circles again. Monday morning, I met my attorney. He was exactly the kind of person you'd want during a legal dispute. Calm, methodical, and completely uninterested in anyone's excuses. He carefully reviewed every document I'd brought with me. The lease, payment records, utility bills, text messages, the formal notice, and even screenshots from the night of the party. When he finished reading everything, he closed the folder and looked at me. "You've documented this extremely well." "I like plans." He smiled. "I noticed." An hour later, the unlawful detainer lawsuit was officially filed. Walking out of his office felt strangely anticlimactic. There wasn't any triumphant music, no dramatic courtroom speech, just another receipt in my purse, another legal bill, another reminder that doing things properly often costs more than doing them emotionally. The court process dragged on for weeks. Nathan never filed a meaningful defense. Then he failed to appear at the hearing altogether. The judge entered a default judgment. After that came another waiting period while the sheriff posted the final notice to vacate. By the time everything was finished, I'd been paying rent on an apartment I couldn't even live in for well over a month. I slept on Olivia's guest bed, lived out of 2 suitcases, drove across town every morning just to get to work. Some nights I wondered whether people who say, "justice always wins," had ever actually been through the legal system. People like to say justice always wins. After living through this process, I learned a more accurate version. Justice usually arrives, but it rarely arrives quickly. The sheriff scheduled the lockout for a Tuesday morning. I arrived early. My attorney was there. The property manager stood beside him. Two sheriff's deputies reviewed paperwork while unlocking the building's service entrance. One of them looked at me kindly. Ready? I've been ready for weeks. We walked upstairs together. The deputy knocked firmly. Sheriff's office. No answer. He knocked again. After nearly a minute, Nathan opened the door. His face looked exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. He hadn't shaved in days. The confidence he'd worn the night of the party was completely gone. Mr. Brooks, the deputy said evenly, the court has ordered possession of this property returned to the leaseholder. You have 15 minutes to collect essential personal belongings. Nathan looked past the deputies until his eyes found me. Emily. I didn't answer. He tried again. Please. The deputy interrupted him. Sir, you need to start packing. For the next 15 minutes, Nathan silently stuffed clothes into 2 black garbage bags. Every few minutes he'd stop, glance around the apartment, then continue packing as though he still couldn't believe this was actually happening. The confidence he'd worn the night of the party was gone. Standing there, he looked less like the man who'd given me an ultimatum, and more like someone finally realizing that some decisions can't be undone. Not because I wanted revenge, because those were the legal consequences he'd chosen. When the deputies finally escorted him outside, he stopped beside me. I never thought you'd actually do it. I met his eyes for the first time that morning. I know. Then he walked away. I believed that would be the end. I was wrong. Because when the property manager and I finally stepped back inside the apartment, I realized losing the relationship hadn't been the most painful part. Seeing what he'd done to the home we'd built together. That was. The apartment smelled wrong. Not dirty. Not musty. Just abandoned. It was the kind of silence that settles into a place after too many arguments, too many slammed doors, and too many nights where nobody cared anymore. One of the sheriff's deputies handed me the keys. It's yours again. I thanked him, but I couldn't make myself walk any farther. For weeks I'd imagined this moment. I'd pictured opening the door, breathing a sigh of relief, and finally feeling like I was home again. Instead, I stood there wondering if home was something that could actually be broken. The property manager stepped inside first. He stopped after only a few steps. Oh, I followed him in. My stomach dropped. At first glance, the apartment looked normal enough. The farther I walked into the apartment, the worse everything became. Deep scratches scarred the hardwood floors. The cream-colored sofa had been slashed beyond repair, and when I lifted my eyes, the digital displays I'd spent months programming hung shattered across the wall. By the time I reached the kitchen, it was obvious none of the damage had happened by accident. The property manager slowly shook his head. That wasn't normal wear and tear. No, I said quietly. It wasn't. Then I looked up. My eyes lifted toward the 3 digital art displays I'd spent months programming. Every screen was still hanging on the wall, but each one had been smashed until nothing worth saving remained. The screens were still hanging on the wall, but every panel was shattered, spiderweb cracks stretching across the glass. Someone had hit them over and over until nothing was left worth repairing. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. Those displays weren't just expensive electronics. I'd spent months programming the artwork that rotated across them. Every transition, every lighting scene, every animation had been something I'd built because I loved creating spaces that felt alive. They hadn't just broken equipment. They destroyed something I had poured part of myself into. The kitchen wasn't any better. Coffee grounds and flour had been dumped into the sink before someone turned on the faucet, creating a thick concrete-like sludge inside the drain. Cabinet doors hung crooked. One drawer had been pulled so hard it no longer closed properly. The apartment looked less like someone had moved out, and more like someone had wanted to punish the walls for still belonging to me. The property manager took photographs while I silently walked from room to room. Every few feet I found something else. A cracked light fixture, a broken dining chair, a mirror with a corner smashed in. Each discovery felt strangely smaller than the one before it. After enough damage, your mind quietly stops reacting. It isn't acceptance, it's exhaustion. Then I reached the kitchen counter. Under an empty fast food bag sat a folded sheet of notebook paper. My name was written across the front. I unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Nathan's. Hope it was worth it. You ruined my life, so I ruined the only place you ever cared about. Enjoy fixing everything. You'll end up alone anyway. I read it twice, then folded it again. My attorney, who had arrived a few minutes earlier to meet me for the walkthrough, noticed the paper in my hand. What's that? I handed it to him. He read it without saying a word. Then he carefully slipped it into a document sleeve. Don't throw anything away, he said. I wasn't planning to. Over the next hour, we documented everything. from the ruined sofa and scratched hardwood floors to the shattered displays, damaged plumbing, and broken furniture scattered throughout the apartment. The repair estimates climbed higher with every new inspection. By the time the contractor finished his preliminary report, the damage inside the apartment alone was estimated at more than $15,000. I should have been furious. Instead, I felt oddly detached because the apartment could be repaired. Wood can be replaced. Furniture can be bought again. Glass can be installed. What I couldn't replace was the version of myself who once believed love meant endlessly giving people another chance. That woman was gone. And maybe that wasn't a loss. The landlord immediately began pursuing Nathan for the property damage that exceeded the security deposit. As for me, my attorney helped me file a separate civil claim covering my destroyed belongings, legal fees, temporary housing costs, and everything else I'd paid because Nathan refused to leave when he legally should have. Several weeks later, we were back in court. Nathan arrived with Carol. He looked exhausted, older than he had just a few months earlier. When our eyes met across the courtroom, he looked away first. The judge reviewed the eviction file before turning to my claim. Nathan tried to defend himself. He insisted I had exaggerated the damage. He suggested some of it had already existed. He even implied I was simply trying to make him pay for a broken relationship. My attorney waited patiently until he finished. Then he began placing evidence on the judge's bench one piece at a time. Photographs taken the morning of the party, showing the apartment in perfect condition. Receipts for the furniture. Purchase records for the custom equipment. Repair estimates. The sheriff's inspection. The property manager's report. Finally, he handed over Nathan's handwritten note. The courtroom fell quiet while the judge read it. He looked up. "Mr. Brooks," Nathan swallowed. "Did you write this?" A long silence followed. Finally, he nodded. Yes." That single word ended whatever chance he had left. The judge ruled almost immediately. Judgment was entered in my favor. Nathan was ordered to compensate me for the maximum amount available under the claim, while the landlord continued pursuing additional damages separately. When we walked out of the courthouse, Carol caught up with me in the hallway. She looked tired, far more tired than angry. "I wish this hadn't happened." "So do I." She hesitated before speaking again. "He really did love you." I believed her. "I know. But loving someone isn't enough if you don't respect them." Tears gathered in her eyes. She nodded once, then quietly walked away. I never saw Nathan again. Months later, the apartment finally looked like itself again. New hardwood covered the floors, fresh paint brightened the walls, and the shattered displays had been replaced, although I never rebuilt the system that once powered them. People ask why. The truth is simple. For a long time, I believed the smartest thing in my apartment was the technology I'd designed. I was wrong. Every now and then, someone still asks whether ending a 2-year relationship over one party was really worth it. I never argue with them anymore. I simply smile, because they were never there the night someone asked me to trade my self-respect for the privilege of staying in his life. People still think this story ended because my boyfriend invited his ex to a party. It didn't. Relationships survive uncomfortable conversations all the time. Ours ended the moment Nathan believed I should sacrifice my self-respect just to prove I loved him. Looking back, I don't remember the expensive party nearly as clearly as I remember opening that front door, smiling at Sophia, shaking her hand, and quietly saying, "He's all yours." At the time, I thought I was walking away from the person I loved. Years later, I still remember the sound of that apartment door closing behind me. At the time, I thought it was the end of my relationship. Looking back now, it was the first sound of the life I should have chosen all along.